There's not much peace walking along the turnpikes nowadays. This is the A74. Just a constant din of noise, and I've got to wear this thing in case I get run down. But I'm turning off here because down there there's something very special. What a fine feeling of peace the moment you get off that road. Suddenly you begin to see the countryside, because when you're walking along the road, or even worse, if you're driving along it, you're busy looking behind you, looking in front of you. You're always conscious of this movement. But when you step off and see these rounded hills of the Dodds and the Riggs and the Cairns, you get the feeling of coming in to the real Scotland, this rather remote corner of Lanarkshire. And it's from these Lanarkshire hills the Clyde begins its journey from the hills to the sea. And there's a wee bit of a mystery here. I've got a book in my pack here by Neil Munro, great Scottish writer, wrote some marvellous books, and this book is called The Clyde from the Source to Its Mouth. Illustrated in colour, a great book, and Neil went up these hills to find the source of the Clyde. This is the very first place on the map at Crawford where the Clyde is marked as the River Clyde, and Neil Munro went looking for its source, and he found it just above the summit of Beatock, a place called Elven Foot. Well, the strange thing is, when you come to look at this, you discover there's a wee bit of a mystery, and I think maybe Neil Munro was misled, and I'm going to investigate that today. Watling Street, a bit of the old Roman road that extended from Dover to York, with a branch running from Carlisle over Beatock Summit, quite near the source of the Clyde. Behind me is the A74 climbing to Beatock Summit, and the wee burn here is the Little Clyde, which flows into the Clyde just down there. But the stream that Neil Munro went to is a mile that side, and unfortunately that stream flows the other side of Beatock Summit, which means it goes to the Solway, not into the Clyde at all. If you were lazy, you might regard this as the true source of the Clyde, the Dar, where it becomes a big reservoir collecting the water from the hills. But I'm going a bit further. I'm going to follow the stream that comes into the reservoir. I'm 1,500 feet up in the hills, 9 miles from the railway, and where this burn, the thick cleuch, meets that burn called the Dar, is the beginning of the Clyde. How do I know? Well, I'll tell you. I looked back some very old geographical books, away back last century, and it's given clearly beyond any doubt that the headwaters of the Clyde can be found in the Dar water, which is its greatest tributary, coming down from these hills. And there's an old rhyme which says, Annan, Tweed and Clyde rise on a hillside. And no doubt that's why the railway company decided to run their excursions. There was a railway station at Elven Foot, and it was easy to say, up there is where the three great rivers rise, including the Clyde. The Clyde comes from the Brythonic language, Welsh, it's akin to Welsh, and the Clyde means the strong river, and never was there a better description. It's longer than the Tay, it's longer than the Forth, and I'm going to take a loop over it where it begins its life. Well, it's great to see a film that you've made a long time ago and relive the experience. And that was a particularly fine winter day. No wind, pale blue sky. You would never have known that in a few days' time it would be snowing. And in the interval, it was raining for us. We were staying in Crawford amongst these loathered hills. The Clyde rises on the west side of the Beta group. Now these hills, although they're very rounded, and although they seem very tame, in fact, they still are some of the loneliest hills in Scotland. And from Crawford, all sorts of openings lead off, because in the old days, before there was an A74, the passes from the Solway side came over the lower hills, past Warnock Head, the highest village in Scotland, higher than Tomintoul, although many people say it's the highest, but it's the highest in the Highlands. And right below Warnock Head, another village called Lead Hills. So one day in the rain, I went up to Lead Hills just to have a look around and found myself in a most extraordinary place, a wee library. What a place. I feel like the Beatles, except that this isn't the Bible. This is a book, a journal, going away back to 1842. And I got a shock when I opened it, because here's an entry referring to one Thomas Weir, myself. It says, Thomas Weir went underground at Susanna. That's the name of a vein, a lead vein, about 6 o'clock. Visited the workings in a part of that mine, visited the workers above ground, and let the following bargains. And there follows a list of names. The bargains were made with the men to pay them a rate for the job of taking out the ore from which the lead was extracted. Because this is a village of Lead Hills, one of the 2 highest villages in Scotland. And this little pulpit that I'm in is in the miners' library, the oldest library of its kind in Britain. And right above me is the inscription, "Learning makes the genius bright." And the man who started this library was none other than the great poet Alan Ramsay, who was born here in Lead Hills, went to live in Edinburgh, started the first circulating library in the world in Edinburgh, and no doubt, with the inspiration of that, brought some of its benefits to Lead Hills. And the library is a great collection of things, not only a miner's library, a theological library, the records of, unique records of all the mining that's gone on here in the last 200 or 300 years. There's a fine collection of minerals, photographs, a history of a most remarkable village encapsulated here. And I'm going to have a word with the ladies who have made it possible for people like myself to come in and have a read here. 3 of the ladies of the library committee who showed me my name in the book. Mrs. Cameron on the right, Miss Holly in the centre, and Mrs. Smith on the extreme left. You're the social secretary, Mrs.
Yes.
What kind of things go on now?
Well, we have the whist drives every week, and we have a sale of work once a year, and we run a big little raffle, you know, to bring in money.
I see. So the old library is still doing its stuff?
Oh, yes, oh, yes.
And what about these books? I know these are 2 particularly valuable books with a wee bit of a story attached to them.
Yes, the top one is a first edition of Gulliver's Travels. It was discovered during the summer. That was when we first knew that we had such a thing in the library.
Great, what a find.
It was.
And what about this one?
That, the Annals of the Old and New Testament, that was reputed to be found in the loft during the renovation of the place. And it's a very old, very valuable book.
How old is it?
1658.
So new discoveries are always being made.
Oh, yes.
But the library itself is not used so much by the villagers, I believe.
Not at all by the villagers.
Not at all?
Not really. It's mostly students who come in and people who are researching.
For people like myself?
Yes.
Well, I'll just have a wee quiet corner because it's a very comfortable place, and I must say you're doing a great job here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Aye, a quiet corner The ladies lit the fire, they brought me cups of tea, they pointed out all sorts of things that I would never have found for myself. And the things that you find out in that library, apart from all the gold and silver that's been found, the people who have come to Lead Hills and changed the nature of the place because they were so far-sighted. And one extraordinary man, apart from Alan Ramsay, was a man they called the Venetian. Collier's essays, Milton, Dickens, the works of the great Dr. Johnson, and something here about life in Italy. And one of the great men of all time in Lead Hills was a Scotsman by the name of James Stirling. He came here at the age of 43, marvellous scholar, but everybody wondered why he came to Lead Hills. He was such a brilliant mathematician with a great academic life behind him. The reason is he was a suspected Jacobite. He'd been arrested at about the time of the first Jacobite rising. And it was a great stroke of fortune for the people of Lead Hills that he came here, because the first thing he noted about the miners, who were working very long shifts and the mine was doing very poorly financially, the first thing he noticed was how intelligent they were and how industrious. And after he'd applied his mind to this kind of industry, he cut the shifts from about 10 hours to 6 hours. And in no time at all, the mine was beginning to pay profits, and the men were beginning to enjoy life much more, because he taught them a lot of things which they hadn't thought about. He encouraged them to break up wee plots of land, to keep cattle, to apply themselves to study, because at that time education by no means belonged to everybody. Ordinary working men weren't educated. They had no means. There was no compulsory schooling. And he instilled into them the benefits that would accrue to them, and did extremely well himself and made life for the miners good. So you can say that he was a pioneer in the same way that Robert Owen of New Lanark was, and he's remembered warmly by the folks of Lead Hills to this day. Ramsay's fame extended far beyond Scotland for his collection of poetry and the songs he wrote of Scotland, which paved the way for Burns and Ferguson. That was something very notable, but even more notable was what he did for this village, so far as the people of Lead Hills are concerned. And the same applies to James Stirling, one of the great mathematicians of the 18th century. Because his face didn't fit in politics, he came here and gave his great gifts to this village. And I'm away to take a close look at it. It's probably true to say that there was never a time in history when so many young old men were going about. I base that on the evidence of folks I know. Some people think I'm a spry fellow, but I'm a youngster compared to some of the folks I know. For example, a friend of mine, Stan Bradshaw, a fell runner, came to the house the other day, and he told me he was going in for the Ben Nevis race for the 16th time. He's a veteran, and yet his time for the return journey to the top from Fort William, or from the Fort William Park, is 2.5 hours. I met a man of 70 who had climbed every peak in the Coolin Ridge in one day, and that's very exceptional going. So I wasn't really surprised when I read in the papers the other day of a Japanese gentleman by the name of Mr. Aizume, who was celebrating his 114th birthday. But that's nothing to Lead Hills, where they've got an exceptional record. Ah well, great morning for a walk here in Lead Hills, one of the 2 highest villages in Scotland. And here I am using a stick in this wee slope. You must think I'm getting past it. But this fine old piece of blackthorn belonged to an extraordinary man by the name of John Taylor. Extraordinary? I'll tell you why. At the age of 116, he went out fishing up in the hills there. He went away up 2 burns to fish, and it came on snowing, and it got heavier and heavier. It became a really wild blizzard, and old John was beginning to get a bit concerned about getting home. He was 116 at the time, remember, and there was something that he had to consider, and that was to leave his rod and his stuff and beat it over the hills, which he did. Only he didn't quite make it. A search party was made. John was found alive. He revived fine, and the first thing he did was went back to look for his fishing rod. That man lived and worked in the mines until he was 127. And at the age of 128, he lived 2 miles down the road. He walked up the road, visited his children and grandchildren, and walked back again. Well, John Taylor was a miner from a very early age. He can remember, or could remember, the great eclipse of the sun, the total eclipse in 1652. The only man who could do so in this village, and he used to love to talk about the Mirka day, when he was called up out of the mines because birds were falling out of the sky. Day had been turned into night. Now John Taylor is buried over the wall, and I want to see his grave. Now, where are we? Here, what's this? In memory of Thomas Weir, overseer to the Scots Mining Company, died 11th April 1852. Reading your own gravestone. Ah, here we are. The headstone of John Taylor. It says in the grave, John Taylor, aged 137. Well, people around here say that that isn't true, that he was a mere youngster of 133 when he died. And why I've got this stick is I'm hoping that some of that benefit will rub off on me. You know, at the age of 128, a year after John had retired from the mines, he lived 2 miles down the valley then, in a thatched button ben like most of the folk here. He walked up the valley to visit his children and grandchildren and walked back again. And it's said that latterly, after he retired, he used to feel the cold a bit. In the really cold weather, he used to go to bed and take a glass of brandy occasionally to warm his stomach. I was shown this place called Gauskers as the place where old John Taylor finished his days. A grouse moor today, and amongst the heather there you can see the outlines of old John's house. Now, Mrs. Jenny Kay, you've a rare old story about John Taylor. Tell me it again.
Well, they say when he was 100 years of age, he thought the Lord had forgotten about him. And he asked his friends to take him up to the top of the highest hill, the Green Lowther, and leave him there, which they did, beseeching the Lord to remember his faithful servant and take him into glory. But the Lord had other ideas, so his friends had to go and bring him home again, where he lived for other 33 years.
To 133?
Yes.
Well, he saw a lot of changes, and if some of this good luck of that stick rubs off on me, I'll see a few myself.
I'll see you will.
Let's go to that cup of tea. Fine.
Right.
I brought up an old boy, John Taylor, and he had a grandson who became a mine manager. So there was good stuff there. A man, John, in his prime at 90. Well, there's hope for us all in that. Now, there's a lot of other names about here. Long before John was a mining man, they were taking out a lot of gold. And one man who's remembered is a man called Bevis Bulmer. He's remembered in Bulmer's Moss. He made over £100,000 in gold. He had 30 men working for him. But he died a poor man. He was knighted for his great work for the country, and he died in debt to the tune of £340. He must have been living it up. And then he was followed by another man who was mining gold and did very well. And this man, George Bowes, he fell down a mine shaft and was killed. So it looks as if you should stick to lead, and one great miner is remembered. You're apt to think of the Hebrides and the Highlands as the places that export men, lads of Perks, who make their marks in other parts of the world. But where I am now in Lead Hills, 1,300 feet above sea level, one of the two highest villages in Scotland, you find a Symington Street. Allan Ramsay Institute, the grave of John Taylor, and over there, the Symington Memorial. And I'm going to take a wee walk over there and find out what it's about. Well, that's William Symington's monument, and the wee boat that's shown on it is the Charlotte Dundas, famous throughout the world as the very first steamship to ply successfully, and yet it brought no good to William Symington in terms of money. Now, Symington made such a great discovery that it's been tried to be claimed by Frenchmen and Americans, but the hard fact of the matter is that this boy, who was born here in Lead Hills 6 years after Allan Ramsay the poet died, was a fine engineer. He worked in the mines here. He was a great developer of steam and the application of pumping water from the pits to give the miners room to work. Every aspect of steam, which of course was replacing the older forms of locomotion, coal and charcoal, was being put to full use. But nobody had yet applied it to ships. So the very clever Symington got to work, and after one or two unsuccessful experiments, he put a boat on Dalswinton Loch, and it was a success. Working by steam, Robert Burns was there seeing it. There was a great crowd gathered, and the successor of that ship was the Charlotte Dundas, to ply in the Forth and Clyde Canal, quite near where I used to live in Glasgow, incidentally. Now, this ship could have been of very great use in that canal, because that was a time before the railways when the canals were mainly used for every kind of overland transport, using the waterways through the country. But what happened here was that the shareholders of the Forth and Clyde Canal were frightened that this new type ship with a big bow wave would damage the canal banks. And the result was that the Charlotte Dundas was not used for pulling barges as had been intended. It was only used for dredging the canal. And then came a break for William Symington. He was given the chance to build 7 steamships. And I've no doubt that he felt, oh, well, this is my big chance. I'm going to make a good go of this, show the world what these steamships can do. And the patron who gave him that thing to do died, and the order was cancelled. And at the end of the day, all William Symington got from the government was £100 and £50, not the pension he had hoped for. And William Symington died a poor and disappointed man, despite the fact that he was an inspiration to all the engineers who followed him. Bell and Fulton made the profit. William Symington is remembered as the prophet, the real honour. What a lot to find in one wee village perched above the M74. So if you're driving down that way, forget the busy highway, turn off and step back into history, and you'll find plenty to interest you.